Welcome back. This is part 2 of the Basics of Composition video lecture. We're going to talk about types of paragraphs and essays, and you can find more information about this in 4D of your McGraw-Hill Handbook. This is probably the most overwhelming part of this lecture. It also might be the most overwhelming part of the whole semester. You don't need to memorize all of this stuff. You don't need to be ready to, have it as a quiz or anything like that. I don't even think I ask about this on the quiz. This is mostly to familiarize you with some terms that you're likely to see in 101 and in some classes after that, because teachers do tend to refer to these types of paragraphs and essays. So I wanted to make sure you knew what they were. Okay, so different types of topics require different approaches, right? You wouldn't use the same approach for a lab report as you would for a personal essay. So the main types of essays and paragraphs are illustration, narration, description, classification and division, definition, analogy, process, cause and effect, comparison and contrast, and persuasive argumentative. And each of these describe the purpose of the paragraph or the essay. So we're not going to cover all of them in this class. We're going to cover description, narration, definition, compare, contrast, and persuasive argumentative. These are the ones that you are most likely to use in your writing going forward and in classes. But they are still helpful terms to know for future classes. So with an illustration paragraph, the goal is to make abstract ideas more concrete. So the topic sentence is going to focus on an idea. You want to show, don't tell, so use a lot of descriptive details. And they often involve anecdotes, descriptions, or appeals to emotion. What that means is that they rely on evoking the reader's emotion in order to make the point. So narration is similar, but the goal is to tell a story. So it recounts a series of events. Again, you're going to want to use a lot of descriptive details. And again, it's often going to involve anecdotes, descriptions, and appeals to emotion. A descriptive paragraph, the goal is to describe a person, place, thing, or activity in a vivid way. It's basically the same as an illustration paragraph, but it's with something tangible, like an object. It appeals to senses, show, don't tell, and often involves anecdotes, descriptions, and appeals to emotions. Now, you might have noticed that these last few on all three of these types of paragraphs is the same. The paragraphs are very similar. The main difference is in the goal. So in an illustration, it's an idea. In a narrative, it's a story. In a descriptive, it's an object, person, place, or activity. Otherwise, the paragraph structure is pretty much identical. The techniques you use for these three are pretty much identical. Just the difference is in what's being described. Classification and division. This is the type of paragraph that has always created the most confusion for me personally, because my brain doesn't work this way. But the goal is to combine individual entities into larger groups, which is classification, or break large groups into smaller parts, which is division, in order to analyze the groups or parts. And the paragraph movement is from general to specific or specific to general. This is often academic. It often uses data, statistic, or other logical appeals. It is a pretty high-level type of paragraph and not one I think you're likely to use very often in 100 or 101. A definition paragraph, this is something that we'll be doing in this class. So the goal is to define a word or a concept for a reader. Definition paragraphs often occur very early in an essay, or a definition will often occur very early in a paragraph. You can, and we will do this, you can have an entire paragraph that is a definition paragraph, but it's a lot more common for it to just be a part of another type of paragraph. And it explains and describes the main attributes of the thing you're defining in order to create a foundation and kind of make sure everyone is on the same figurative page. An analogy, the goal is to explain an unfamiliar abstract concept by using something the reader likely already understands. And it compares two things that initially seem different. So an example is that the eye works like a camera, or the brain works like a computer. We may not understand how the brain works, but it might be easier to understand, say, how we categorize memories in our brain by comparing it to how we use files on a computer, or to explain intelligence as roughly equivalent to processing speed in a computer. So if you did that in a paragraph and it was through the whole paragraph, that would be an analogy paragraph. And it basically is just using metaphors or similes, which are figurative language that compares one thing to another thing to explain a concept that might be harder for the reader to understand. A process paragraph, this is a fancy term for a how-to paragraph. So the goal is to explain how to do something or how something works. It's a how-to paragraph or essay. And the focus is on the process. The organization is often by steps. So first you do this, second you do this. And you tend to use descriptive techniques or analogies to make the steps easier for the reader to understand. We're not doing that in this class. Cause and effect is similar to a process, but the goal is to describe how something happened or focus on the causes and the results. The focus is on the results more than the process itself. So instead of saying first you do this, second you do this, you're focusing on as a result of this, as a result of X, Y happened. So also it's similar to a process paragraph, but it's normally about an event or a potential consequence rather than describing how something happens or how to do something. And it is more academic than a process paragraph. It's much more likely to use data and statistics as evidence. This is something you are likely to use, especially in history papers. Compare contrast, we will do this one as well, is to highlight similarities and differences between two or more things, people, places, or ideas. And we're going to focus on doing a compare contrast paragraph and a compare contrast essay at some point in this class, but you will actually use the techniques for compare and contrast in pretty much any type of essay you use, any type of writing you do. We do often already use these skills in decision making. So let's say you're looking at two different cars and you're trying to decide which one you want. You're going to go through the process of compare contrast in your head. Let's say that you are comparing two movies, like, oh my God, I like that movie so much better than that other movie. Well, that's compare and contrast. You're going to sit there and you're going to say why you like one movie better than another. And that's really all you're doing in compare contrast. It is sometimes approached as a pro and con. So here are the pros of this decision, here are the cons of this decision, or here are the advantages or disadvantages, or the good and the bad. So those are common ways to approach the compare contrast paragraph. I didn't include persuasive argumentative in this PowerPoint because it is a little bit more complicated, and it tends to combine other modes, other types of paragraphs. So, but in a persuasive argumentative, the goal is to explain, using whatever techniques you need to use, why your perspective is valid or why you're right. So in essays, we call these types of paragraphs rhetorical modes. You might see that term. Rhetorical mode just means type of essay or type of paragraph. It's a fancy term. Modes are often combined. So when we're doing the paragraphs, you'll have a descriptive paragraph and you'll have a narrative paragraph. When we get to the essays, we're going to combine them into the descriptive narrative because they tend to work better when you combine them, and it's easier to write that way. Similarly with the persuasive argumentative, technically persuasive and argumentative are two different modes. Argumentative is very logically based, very scientifically based. Persuasive is emotionally based. But you'll use both of those types of techniques in a good essay, so we combine them. If we want to be really technical, compare and contrast is actually two different modes. Compare is one mode, contrast is another. Compare is showing things that are alike, contrast is showing things that are different. But it would be very challenging to try to do just one of the two, and so we do combine them. And you will often use more than one paragraph type in an essay. And we'll talk more about that in later PowerPoints and in later lessons. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the paragraph types. I am going to stop here to kind of give you guys a break before we start talking about the writing process. Go get a cup of coffee or your beverage of choice, preferably legal, and come back in just a minute to look at the next lecture.